Welcome to this week's Ibstock talk, and I'm very pleased to welcome Tim Pitman from Pitman Tozer Architects. I talked with Tim when I was over in Cardiff a few years ago, and we've asked him to talk about the work that his practice is doing, looking at homes and how you move from homes to houses and housing. So, Tim, thank you for coming. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much for the invite. It's always a kind of good opportunity to kind of stop looking that close at the work you're doing and actually kind of have a little bit of an overview. So preparing something like this is a good way to reflect, so good for us. So yes, the kind of request was to talk about housing and houses, which is kind of good because that is very much the world that we're in. And I suppose one of the things that we've become interested in and kind of encouraged to think about is the word homes as well as houses and housing, hence the title. In the spirit of trying to do some very thorough research, I looked some stuff up on Wikipedia, and I looked at the definition of the kind of three, and I don't intend to kind of read them out to you, but they're there, and I'll leave that for a second, and we'll perhaps come back to this right at the end, which is seeing how those definitions interweave and overlap. And I guess the kind of thought that home was the overarching word that perhaps includes house and housing, kind of unites them, is something that I think is true, although the more often I read that, the more confused I get, so maybe you can help me with that too. And then there's this other quote as well, which is from Winston Churchill, and I will read this out. "We shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us." And it's an interesting quote, but like all quotes, completely out of context. The reason for this quote was he was trying to persuade the Houses of Parliament that the building that they're in that was badly damaged in the war should be rebuilt exactly as it was, a pastiche, which perhaps is not what we're interested in. But the spirit about our relationship to buildings is kind of crucial. And at the bottom here, I put, perhaps it begins the other way around, in the sense that before we can make buildings, we are shaped by them, then we make them, and then they shape us again. I'm not sure. But certainly as architects and having that privilege, as it were, to make buildings, perhaps it is pertinent. And that leads me on, which is before I talk about our work, I'll talk a little bit about, I suppose, some influences. And coming back to this theme, that Churchill theme about this is very literally the homes that shaped us. And when I say us, I gave a version of this talk with my business partner, a kind of two-man talk. So the us is me and Luke, who isn't here. So the first house that I ever lived in, and this is, I suppose, going to cover some typologies, which I'm sure is a word that's come onto your radar. So we'll start with a detached house. And I grew up in rural Worcestershire, and we lived in a detached house in a village. I'm not going to show you that particular house, but it wasn't a million miles away from a house that I played with, or a house that I looked at in one of my favourite books at the time. That was it. Then, this is like before architecture. Then architecture came along, an architecture school itself. And both my business partner and I, we met when we were at university at Cambridge. And this was probably our exposure, very direct exposure to the typology, which is courtyards. I went to Churchill College, and this was, I would say, quite traditional courtyards, illustrated very much by this second slide, which is a plan. But as you'll see, it was kind of done in the late 50s, early 60s. So a modernist interpretation of what you might imagine a traditional Cambridge college to look like. Perhaps if you looked at King's College and its layout, you'd see some of these very defined squares. Luke, however, was just down the road at Robinson College, which is newer, a 70s building. It too had the same quality of courtyards though, but in a far less literal interpretation of the historic. you actually get this mega structure rather than sprawling all over kind of a large campus area. It's actually relatively tight and stacked, but you do still get these recognisable big entrance courtyard from your entrance here, your accommodation, and then again forming another courtyard here, a little courtyard there. So we got courtyards. Then our journey took us up to Glasgow to study, and we found, and like many students going up to Glasgow, we found ourselves in the west end of the city, living in tenement blocks, which were interesting in the sense they were purpose designed as flats, and what you'd get is this kind of wall of housing defining a street, and you have a walk-up staircase, a number of flats, probably usually 2 per floor. And here is an aerial view of that bit of Glasgow. So what you start to see and what we start to learn and what they were very keen to teach you when you're in Glasgow was this kind of urban strategy, which was, if we take this one here, there you have, if you like, the classic perimeter block. I'm not sure, is there a Bristol equivalent of the perimeter block? I bet there is somewhere. So what you get is a almost continual block of housing, protecting an inner area, defining a street. So you begin to see really clearly where you live, where's public, and where's potentially private, and private, shared private. So this is the space that all of the people can use, but not necessarily everyone on the street. So beginning to understand these hierarchies, and they became important to our work later on. Next stop was down to London. And again, like many people arriving in London as a student, we ended up living in a terraced house which was converted from a house into a series of bedsits and flats. So this is one of the streets we're on. Not so much to learn from this, I don't think, other than some types of building don't convert very well to flats. I suppose what you do begin to see again, repeating from Glasgow, is this idea that buildings, a line of buildings, a terrace of buildings, defining a street, is a potential urban response to housing. After life in a terrace, it was life in a tower, and I briefly got to live on the 29th floor of Trellick Tower. I don't know whether you've come across Trellick Tower in any of your studies yet, by Erno Goldfinger in the late 1970s. So this again was a move to another kind of type of housing, and a type of housing that's kind of becoming very prevalent in London where we're working at the moment. And here's a kind of dramatic axonometric drawing of it, and I suppose it highlights this classic thing, the tower and its big looming shadow. More of that later. Then, so I suppose that is a little potted history of where I've lived, and it's not necessarily to kind of, I don't want to divulge my life particularly and tell you a story of, but more to say, you begin to, or you should begin to start analysing where you live and trying to understand that as typologies. That is, your experience is a rich source of what can help you later, rather than just being constantly shown other architects' work. You know, your personal experience should help you hugely. That said, other people's homes are pretty important to your education. And one of the places I got to work briefly for a summer for 6 months was Amsterdam. And that 6 months and many visits since has proved to be very crucial, again, in terms of understanding of architecture and housing in particular. And we worked there, again, my business partner and I, for one summer. We were privileged to work for Aldo and Hanny van Eyck, who, again, you might have come up in certain lectures, and certainly worth looking at their work. And when we were there was a lot of, this was kind of mid-1990s, there was an awful lot of work happening, new housing areas being made on industrial land. And so this is an area out towards the kind of northeast of central Amsterdam, if any of you know it. And this was called Java and KNSM Island. And what this used to have until the late 80s, early 90s, was just giant warehouses. And these were the, I suppose, Dutch trading countries, part of their empire. And so this was a giant port with whatever was going on. So we kind of found ourselves beginning to look at well, London was probably a bit sleepy and in recession, which was our experience and where we were working, a kind of city eagerly rebuilding itself. And as I say, this island was perhaps the most notable architecturally. And this side of the island, there was this development. And I don't know whether, well, I do know, this is pretty much the work of one architect, done to look, perhaps like central Amsterdam if you know it, but to look like it's been done, I think, by many, many architects, and there's a complexity, a huge busyness to it. So there was this half of the island that was intriguing, and then literally next door to it, there were much bigger urban blocks. And so there was this block here that really caught our attention, which was by Hans Koolhof. And I suppose we were more interested in this block. It seemed to be quieter. It seemed to be saying less, look at me. It seemed to be providing a background rather than a theatre. Next door to that building was this building by Dina and Dina. Looked at it more since, and less at the time, but again seemed to be a very simple architecture and a background architecture. And didn't know what to do with this pretty much at the time, but it's amazing how quickly it came back when we started looking at similar projects ourselves. We also, this is in that Hans Koolhof building, and this is a kind of device that we first saw in Amsterdam, and it's not the only place you'll see it, and it's existed historically, which is the Winter Garden, which again I'll talk about more, but crudely speaking, a glazed-in balcony. So in here is your balcony space, but this is your balustrade to your balcony, and this was a pivot window, so you could have it in a closed or open position. It seemed to be kind of an amazing device, and I suppose we were so transfixed we were probably just waiting for our chance to have a go at one. Then to conclude my little holiday photos, which are always uniquely boring, there's Amsterdam perhaps as you know it, and just to say, this is probably also where we worked, but it was the site of our first project. So we've been going 15 years, and our first project was to convert this little warehouse into a flat for a friend. So Amsterdam, important in our education and also important for our business. So I'm going to talk now about two projects that we've done. And I guess in some ways this talk is really a tale of two projects. And I suppose another little kind of lesson to you, and it's in no way supposed to put you off, is architecture is definitely for the patient. I sometimes think in 15 years we've managed to do two projects. It's not entirely true, but I suppose there's two projects that have been kind of, I suppose, well received, or projects that we've wanted to kind of show and talk about. In the background there's lots of other work, but you don't always get the opportunity to do projects of a certain scale. So this one is Gap House in London. This was started in about 2005, we took a couple of years to complete. So I'll just talk you through it. So this is an area of West London, towards the west of Paddington Station. And this is a cul-de-sac called Monmouth Road. And the project that we did was, well, you can see the character of the area is semi-detached villas. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then beginning to get into an urban block. And this little gap here is the site of the project, and hence the Gap House. And this is quite an amazing photograph, which I only found yesterday, which shows it in its gap form. Because the reality was, when we found it, it wasn't a gap. There was this tumble down of buildings. So an architect in the 1950s had kind of found this gap, developed this gap. It reached the end of its natural life, and I think, well, it's a bit of a mess, and I don't think it had got the most out of its kind of quite amazing site. So if we look at the plan, I'll just talk you through it on the ground floor. That is the one semi-detached house there. This is the other semi-detached here, and this is the gap. About 2.2, 2.3 metres. So a lot of the house sits in that gap, but what had happened was the back of the garden to this villa had been sold off to the person who bought the gap. So you come in, you have this very narrow bit of construction, and then here you come into a living space that opens onto a courtyard. Then as you go up, there's an opportunity to get a little mezzanine space, and then the house, a kind of four-bedroom family house stacking up between the gaps. So just wide enough for a single bedroom, and then as it gets wider, the kind of larger spaces that you need. Now, this layout wasn't a million miles away from the existing layout, but what the situation was found was this courtyard was at a different level to this kitchen area. This gap here was very narrow. This glazing to the courtyard was very heavy. There are a series of steps here. So this whole area felt like at least three very separate and unconnected spaces. Moving on now, there's no opportunity for any of the accommodation in this wider space. We just get stacking bedrooms to the front, this staircase, and then bathrooms or other rooms to the rear. We tried to work in model quite a lot in terms of how we kind of developed the scheme. So this was built to kind of test some of these spatial ideas that we'd thought of, and gives you again an idea of the plan that I just spoke you through. So coming down slightly to the street to this main living plan, a taller area, a mezzanine above the living, this stack of bedrooms to the street in the gap, the stair in the middle of the plan, and then, if you like, a cascade of different types of accommodation stepping back there. Just to note, the one of the kind of aims of the project, as well as kind of seeing what was, if you like, possible architecturally in such a space, was also to build as low energy building as possible. So there's no gas boiler. All the heating and hot water is provided by 3 50-metre boreholes, which are 2 in the rear courtyard and 1 in the main space. Water is recycled, rainwater harvesting for flushing and various things there. The one thing we didn't manage to achieve were any photovoltaics, but at the time we were performing way in excess of building regulation standards, to probably equivalent of code 4, which is already redundant if you've come across it. And I suppose one of the things we were keen on is that we would adopt all these technologies, but perhaps not make a big story of it architecturally. None of this is, even if you could particularly, expressed. So I'll just talk you through a few slides of the scheme. So this is the gap. These are the stack of 3 bedrooms in this 2.2 metre gap, and that's you heading downstairs. So this, we did do a previous version of this talk, and this was right next to those Amsterdam houses, and I think whether it's a conscious link or not, these kind of little vertical strips and houses is perhaps something we saw then, thought about again. And then I think this is the main image I really want to talk about, which was by doing some of the things that I spoke of, keeping the floor surface between both the dining area and the living area all at the same level, lowering the courtyard so it's on the same level, widening that gap a little bit between those two gives you this opportunity when you slide open these doors to make a much more generous living space. So taking not just the constrained site between the two party walls, but also when you get that opportunity of connecting spaces and getting this courtyard to work as an extension of all the living spaces. I think that, to me, is the kind of lesson of this project, which is when you're constrained for size, what can you borrow, what can you extend to, what can you open up that gives you a kind of a wider feeling of dimension, so you can feel from one wall to the other. That's just a view there, again, looking into the courtyard here, and then looking up to the mezzanine space and a double height space that we managed to create. A view from looking towards the rear, looking at the kind of stepping back and then increasingly narrowing until it gets back into that gap. View at night time. Then just a little detail of the stair, and just that, I suppose the one thing that we tried to achieve in that middle of the plan was just by pulling the stair out and getting a very small light well in there, we managed to get light all the way down into that lower ground floor, and it also acts with a roof light above as a kind of ventilation for the space as well, so helping with some of the kind of passive aspects of the house. A house, this is housing. So I suppose our office started doing predominantly residential extensions with the odd new build house in that instance. At the same time, we were working for local authorities, beginning to do some housing work. This is the first, not all of which were built, not all of which we got to see built. This was, if you like, the first project that we got to build, we got to work on that's housing from beginning to end. So in some ways, very much our second major project. It's for Peabody. I don't know if you have come across Peabody. They're they're exclusively London-based. They are over 150 years old, and they were set up by a philanthropist, a Victorian philanthropist, who was appalled at the conditions of London and wanted to make good housing for London's working poor. And this was, I suppose, before what might loosely be called social housing. Peabody are now a registered social landlord or a housing association, still with the same mission, attempting to provide, again, in this world of endless definitions, what might as much affordable housing as possible. That's still their remit. The project's called Mint Street, which I'll come to, and it's in Bethnal Green in East London. So again, I'll talk you through the project, its kind of context and restrictions, and then show you our response. So, not all of London, but this is central London here, Buckingham Palace, Trafalgar Square, which is often considered the centre of London, and this is where we find Bethnal Green with the Olympic Park further out to the east for those who know London. So it's not central London, but it's still within one of the kind of more central zones. It's still very well connected. This is an aerial view which shows the neighbourhood. It's a mixed neighbourhood in terms of what it offers. There's a lot of residential property here. You've got one large park here, Weavers Field, and another smaller park. You've got infrastructure in terms of a tube and a train station here and here. You've got a couple of local schools. So out of centre, main shopping street here and other ancillary elements. This is our site in red, this kind of almost hourglass shape. This is the main train line out of Liverpool Street Station. That heads off to Ipswich, that takes you up to Stansted. So this is the site as we found it. housing, 5-storey housing. That was, we'll see soon, but this was rebuilt in the 1970s after bomb damage. We've got an industrial use here, which was workshops. It's now offices. A pub, which was demolished just before we got involved. Single-storey warehouse structures, and then this railway on this elevated railway on a kind of viaduct. Housing here, housing there. So this is the block that we inherited. These are the kind of key parameters. North is up, by the way, so the railway is the kind of southeastern boundary. So I'll talk you through what we identified as the kind of key constraints. And again, I don't know whether this is something you've got into doing when you kind of analyse your sites, but this idea of kind of identifying and communicating the kind of key things you have to work with, respect, or work against even. So one of them was overlooking, which is all of this is housing and it overlooks the site. All of this is housing and it overlooks the site. This also overlooks the site, but it's a different use. It's office use, so it has, whilst it's still overlooked, it has slightly different quality. The noise of the railway, it's undescribably noisy. When you get two trains both going round a curve at the same time, you can't hear yourself think. Whenever we kind of do tours of it, we'll start the tour outside and you just get interrupted. It was to the point that you were wondering whether, on site visit, whether this was even a good idea. Aspect. So we've mentioned you've got the south and east aspect, which is kind of very positive. We knew that the site would be sunny. We knew that we could make, potentially some very well lit flats. The outlook. Also, not having the railway here and other uses, this side of the site got very, very long views, uninterrupted views, which again is quite a rare quality in a relatively dense bit of any city. The plot shape, so this kind of weird plot shape, curving on one aspect, very tight, this dimension here, trying to find where the site to put the housing was obviously a conundrum. And then access to the site, access was only really achievable from this kind of northeastern corner or this southwestern corner. So how would you get into the site? How would you then navigate across the site and get into the housing itself? Then, of course, you'll have all of the things you can identify from the site, and that informs hugely what you do. And then I suppose over all these years of kind of thinking about architecture and talking about it, reading about it, studying it, being taught, you begin to kind of develop certain aspects that you consider more important. So I tried to summarise here what our approach was to housing. And some of them are very general, and you're like, why wouldn't you? So well lit, good aspect, and quiet. Why wouldn't you do all of that? Well, the quiet one's tricky, if you believe me about the railway. Then there's this kind of idea from Amsterdam, and also sometimes a frustration at looking kind of other built work that kind of is so busy it makes your eyes hurt, that housing is perhaps the background architecture of the city, that it should be quiet, shouldn't really draw attention to itself. Maybe that's for other types of architecture to have more formal fun, as it were. There's a definite interest in repairing, and I put reinventing, the urban realm, and that is thinking about how cities work, identifying whether what you've inherited is perhaps has broken how perhaps the city worked, and a chance to do something that repairs it with your work. Increasing the permeability, kind of related to the other, but I suppose it's a personal frustration of kind of walking around bits of cities and you'll find that you can't actually access things. You get whole landlocked bits of the city because of different tenures. And then this idea, perhaps from Glasgow, making streets, reading the fronts, and defining spaces, being very clear what's public and very clear what's private. And again, I suppose the more you look at housing, perhaps you look at post-war housing, blocks in space, it seems to, one of its issues that people talk about a lot is that nobody quite knows what the space is for. So defining space, especially when it's kind of quite precious, seems to be one of the things that we're very interested in. So this, if you like, is our approach before we even put pen to paper. These things were in our mind. These were our ambitions. In terms of dealing with making a good quality environments for your home, this is a little diagrammatic section of what we've got. So we're facing southeast, so we've got some sun. We've got, on the whole, the block is relatively narrow, so we can get, it's only one unit deep typically, so we can get good dual aspect. And then we have this issue of being relatively close to these trains, so the noise predominantly, but also visually you're only kind of 13, 14 metres away. So our friend the Winter Garden that we so fell in love with a few years before seemed to be the kind of perfect device for us, which was if we put our kind of balcony space as a buffer, it kind of helped with privacy, and also by glazing it in meant that we could, well, what we achieve is kind of quadruple glazing between the outside and the inside in that condition, and that was enough to mean that you can sit in this space. And I know I feel like a snake oil salesman when I say this, but you can sit there and these trains go by and you can only see them. It's like watching them on telly with the sound off. Whereas here, you can't hear yourself think. So this device of kind of, well, crudely, of lots of layers of glass is the way that you can make what we think is kind of good quality housing here in a potentially really difficult situation. Then more on this kind of background architecture. So yeah, we've seen it in Amsterdam, but we found it on our doorstep in London. So you find it in the mansion blocks, the Victorian and Edwardian mansion blocks of central London. This perhaps you might argue is not that background. It's kind of quite fancy. They're probably getting quite excited and probably want to be looked at. Round the corner from the site, we found further versions of a tenement mansion block architecture. And again, this is another company called I forget what it is, but at the same time as Peabody, providing the same kind of accommodation. So there's a whole history of kind of mid-19th century philanthropists building housing for London. And then we find ourselves actually on the site itself. So this is the warehouse building that we're next to, which is Allen and Hanbury. They were originally, this was where they made asthma inhalers, and not that interesting in itself, but it's not residential, but again, we found this kind of warehouse type architecture, again, quite a quiet architecture, a background-ish architecture. So, you know, this developing fascination with kind of a quiet and repetitive architecture was kind of growing and evident where we were. So this was a drawing we did at the time, and we'll see a photograph ultimately of this elevation, but this was, if you like, our go at a kind of quiet, repetitive architecture. So, repairing, or as I put, reinventing the urban realm. The history of the site. So, 1870, we've got our railway, we've got a little bit of a mess of different properties going on. We've got an industrial use on that site. We've got Primrose Street here, Violet Street there, 3 Colts Lane, which again we'll see helps define our site. By 1914 rather, we've got this big long line of housing, Caulfield Street, that we saw that looks back onto our site. We've got Violet Street. We've got Primrose Street, which kind of turns and heads to a bit of a cul-de-sac. Got a urinal, but I don't think that's still there. And as we find it now, Caulfield Street, there's our industrial use, and there's our car park area, and 3 Colts Lane here. So this, as we found it, was landlocked with no connection between the two. And I suppose our thought was Primrose Street kind of wants to get to Coventry Road, and we want to make this connection between the two. We want to make a connection that's easier to get from Bethnal Green overground to underground. So whilst this isn't repairing the city in terms of reinstating a street, it's almost bending an existing street to make a new connection. So this is the diagram of what we do. So we clear out the street and we persuade our client that it's a good idea to devote quite a large bit of their site to make a new pedestrian street, which allows anybody to make this route between the two. You can go round, it's not changing it by more than a minute or two in terms of the actual walk, but it's under 2 railways, so we think it's a much more positive connection. We place our housing here in a linear form, not dissimilar to the other types of housing that we've seen. It gives us the chance now, rather than having to enter just here or just here, to make a street where we can enter this block multiply at any point along this new zone. And it gives us a chance of defining very clearly a private area, which is only for the benefit of people who live in this block. So we've kind of got ourselves the diagram that is the lessons that perhaps we'd learnt from various places, Amsterdam, Glasgow, London, wherever we'd been. So public, very clear; private, very clear; a front with access, a back. You know, these are some kind of quite simple lessons of architecture, I think. This was a CGI trying to imagine what the quality of this new pedestrian street would be. So, what's in the block? That block accommodates 67 new flats. 23 are for sale, 17 are shared ownership, and 27 are affordable rent. So this was one of the relatively first buildings that Peabody did in this era where they started selling. And that is due to the fact that subsidies from government dropped, and in order to be able to develop a site like that, there needs to be sale to cross-subsidise the kind of types of ownership that perhaps Peabody are more well known for. One thing that's absolutely key, though, is it's tenure blind. And that means that you don't know what type of ownership it is until you maybe get into the flat itself or even read the lease. So on any door is for any of those uses, any staircase, rather than having cores dedicated to these different tenure types, which happens a lot. You hear stories about kind of poor doors and rich doors. This is deliberately avoiding that issue. And 1, 2 and 3 beds, some maisonettes, 3-bed maisonettes. So reiterating, this is a kind of drawing of the kind of developed form, but we see that same diagram that we saw before, the street. Now this street we wanted to call it Primrose Street, but unfortunately one of those kind of fantastic discussions with a local authority street naming department meant that that wasn't possible because there was one within 2 miles of a similar name. So after lots of toing and froing, Mint Street was kind of considered the acceptable name, so that should be Primrose Street. Here's a more perspective section of that diagram we just saw, and I suppose what I'm wanting to show is the way the section works is that we get a maisonette to deal with our ground floor condition, 2-storey accommodation, front door from the street, no bedrooms directly onto the street here, so trying to get the living accommodation on the lower floor with bedrooms above, so if you like your standard little house. A stack of 4 very similar flat types, and then a setback penthouse-ish top floor. Your street, your protected courtyard to the rear, landscaped. And then on the other side we have a series of railway arches. They are now being redeveloped by Network Rail. They were light industrial use, and they are now moving towards kind of cafe office use, which we hope will give more of a busyness to this side of the street, more activities going on, which I think will benefit, hopefully make for a nicer street. A plan, I don't intend to talk you through in any detail other than to explain how it's organised. So this is the first floor plan, and what you'll see is there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There are your 8 maisonettes. There are 3 cores which take you up to the flats above, and then there are special conditions at the end, and they tended to be dedicated wheelchair accommodation that we was part of the brief. Going up again, not much to say here other than the building begins to step back on its corners, and then the whole of the top floor is set back itself. I will talk you through in a little bit more detail. This is half of a typical landing. So we have a stair and a lift which bring you up, and they've been organised such that you get natural light and natural ventilation into the stairwell itself by turning the lift through 90 degrees facing that way. So we have quite compact, quite well lit circulation. Again, something that doesn't always happen in housing. Then we have 4 flats per floor, so you're looking at half. We have a 2-bed, which has the benefit of dual aspect. We can get all the sleeping accommodation, which is more vulnerable to the noise here, onto the far side, and the living, kitchen, dining is protected by our winter garden. We can't achieve dual aspect for this 1-bed here, but what we do is we use the winter garden here to protect the most vulnerable in terms of noise, which is the 1 bedroom of that bedroom space. In terms of technology, they have mechanical heat ventilation recovery systems, which draws air and exits air all from the quieter rear side as well. This one has a boost mechanism, which means that you can kind of purge you can get better quality of ventilation. Not the same as, but trying to ape the fact that you could open a window here and open a window here. Right, I will speed up. Sorry. Winter gardens, there were 2 types, a window and a wall type, and a curtain glazing. I'll just whiz you through this. I don't think it needs too much explanation. This is just a little story of the construction. It's a concrete frame with a post-tension concrete slab. There's it going up. This is the pouring of a post-tension concrete slab, which is a device of making concrete slabs a little bit thinner and needing less reinforcement, something you might come across. That's it in full, up, and there's London as your kind of, to the west, your skyline. Something you might come across in your careers, windows came before the brickwork, which was kind of a surprise to me and did cause quite a lot of broken windows as we went along, but these are long lead items. You get them to site relatively early. You build the brickwork around them. There are certainly advantages to that. Anyway, quick walk from street to home in terms of photographs of the built project. So that's your kind of photograph again with London there hovering in the background. This is our built version of that long elevation of our background architecture. And also, I mean, not that there's no articulation, the bottom, the maisonette zone articulated in green, the upper articulated in this blue brick. Just enjoying the curve. The street as you find it today, as I say, hopefully this side will become more animated soon. A view that shows kind of entrances. Here's an entrance to a core. Here's a little cutaway in the block that gives you an entrance to 2 wheelchair units. The winter garden more as a kind of totally glazed element when you're below the railway. Then the winter garden as a window in a wall, offering a little bit more privacy when you're on the line of the railway itself. Blank and curved ends to deal with your proximity to your neighbour. We're able to build this bit because this was the site of the original pub, so there's an established structure there. But no windows here for no overlooking and stepping back to allow light to our neighbours. The same on the other end. And here, these little things, these are little kind of pocket windows. So windows to properties, but kind of skewed to look away from the immediate neighbours. I suppose Ibstock get their mention, don't they? So we did actually use Ibstock bricks. We used a green glazed brick, and then we used this blue brindle brick, almost kind of an engineering brick, a relatively cheap brick higher up, and then some of the lovely brickwork of the Allen and Hanbury building behind. This is our courtyard. We used a lighter brick predominantly in here to kind of create a brighter environment, and then this is just an idea of how relatively close we got to the corner of this existing building. A few shots of the interior. We also got to do the fit out of the sale show flat. So this is our version of furnishing a flat, which is a kind of great opportunity. You draw all these furniture layouts in plan, and then to actually have a go with real furniture is quite a lesson. So we got the living, dining and kitchen area all open plan, and we fought to get this kind of window serving hatch to make sure that natural light penetrated as far as the kitchen below. A little device here, perhaps akin to the gap house, where if you try to get a long dimension so you can see all the way through the flat, so that's the back wall of one of the bedrooms. Again, every opportunity you can to try and borrow space, I think is worth taking. This is one of the bedrooms, and this is relative proximity to your neighbour. Not time to go into this, but it was a big worry about, we were worried whether we were building too close, and I think built project satisfied those concerns. Then this is a view towards the winter garden. So this is a version of this kind of glazed-in buffer space that I've been talking a lot about. This is our go at kind of inhabiting how you might choose to live there. You know, it's not an external balcony, but it's not an internal environment. And then here's a little photograph we've got of some of the residents having moved in. People are using them for different things. These two have used it almost as they've made it into their library. I have a dream of going back and trying to photograph each of the not quite 67 different winter gardens just to see how people have used them. Some have taken the garden theme and are kind of totally full of plants. This is a much more kind of an extension of a living space. But this is, and I stress, this is an unheated space other than solar gain through glass. Your thermal line of your building cuts back along that wall, which is to the bedroom, and back round again. So this is essentially outdoors. Right, we're nearly there. Other stuff. So we have built some more houses, and these are a couple of projects that we've completed over the years. And these are some unbuilt schemes. These were the two submissions we did for the recent kind of Peabody frameworks, and giving you an idea that, in a funny way, I feel like I've come on a full little circle, and what we're looking at a lot in terms of the demand for housing in London is relatively tall tower-like structures. So we have a lot of that type of project in the office. And then I'll finish here. So again, you might have come across this in lectures, but this is back to Aldo van Eyck. And in this kind of looping conversation of homes, houses, he had a great interest and in the city and the house. A house is a city is a house, a tree is a leaf is a tree. There's this thing that at different scales, things have shared qualities. So I guess my conclusion is where I started, which probably isn't very clever, which is all of these things are homes, obviously, where people live. People live in one-off homes, people live in housing schemes, but to try and make a home in a housing scheme is the challenge. And then I suppose the bigger challenge is that our cities have the quality of home too. But I'm just basically a bit confused about all this stuff. So that's it. Thank you.